So another question for Greg here. This is from Joanna Eck. In a previous episode, you discussed using chains and bands to alter the resistance curve and its effects as it pertains to training for strength. I was wondering what your take is when it comes to using chains or bands when the goal is hypertrophy.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that is something that I didn't really address in answering the previous question. One thing I will note is that if you are interested in previous questions we've tackled on the podcast, you can go to strongerbyScience.com/QA, and there's a linked archive page of all of the questions that we have previously covered. But anyway, so yeah, someone previously asked about accommodating resistance and its effects on strength gains. So I hemmed and hawed about that for probably entirely too long, but I didn't address hypertrophy. One of the reasons I didn't is that that is not what the research is interested in. It is a little frustrating to me because, if you're doing a longitudinal training study, that's a pain in the ass. It's a lot of work. In my opinion, I'm not someone who will just say, take every measure conceivable so you can slice it up and get 4 papers out of it, or, just have a lot of different variables you can try to p-hack. But for a longitudinal training study, it's such a pain in the ass. Major chronic measures that may actually matter to people, I say take them all. And so, if your lab has an ultrasound where you can measure changes in muscle size, if you're doing a strength study, just measure muscle size as well. It may or may not differ between groups, but you're already doing the work. Get that measure. If you don't have an ultrasound, but you have a DEXA, get leg lean mass. It's not as good, but at least it's something. If you don't have either, take limb circumferences and skin fold thicknesses. There's regression equations you can use to kind of predict changes in cross-sectional area. Not as good as either DEXA or ultrasound assessments, but, again, at least it's something. But anyway, a lot of studies don't do that. And specifically, a lot of the studies on accommodating resistance, using bands and chains, they assess strength outcomes and don't even attempt to assess hypertrophy outcomes. So I didn't really say anything about it then, just because there's not direct research to fall back on. But the question was asked, and so speculate I will. So first things first, kind of the whole theory behind accommodating resistance and why you might want to use it in the first place is that it helps match up the resistance curve with your strength curve. And so by that, I mean that in most of the exercises you do, you're weaker at the bottom and stronger at the top. That's not true for some exercises, like let's say pull-ups, but for things like, squats, generally deadlifts, even though some conventional pullers are weaker at the top, bench press, shoulder press, pretty much anything in the squatting and pressing categories, at least. Most people are going to be quite a bit stronger at the top of the rep than at the bottom. And so when you attach chains or bands to the bar, it helps match up the resistance curve with your strength curve. Instead of moving 400 pounds through an entire range of motion, where at the weakest point you can lift 400 pounds and at the strongest point you can lift 500 pounds, you can put 80 pounds of band tension on the bar with none at the bottom, so that at the bottom it's 400 pounds, it's still very challenging. At the top, it's 480, which is much more similar to the 500 pounds of force you would be capable of producing. So that's kind of what accommodating resistance does for you. And so the question is, could that help with hypertrophy? And I think in general, just to tip my hand a little bit, I think as long as you're smart about it, the effect, one would at least assume, would either be neutral or positive. I do think if you apply it poorly, it could have a negative effect. So to start with, there's reasonably decent evidence that one of the things that matters for hypertrophy is exposing muscles to load through a stretched position. So if you look at research on full range of motion versus partial range of motion, even if you equate to like a range of motion specific 1 rep max, people tend to grow more when they train through a full range of motion. And one of the speculated reasons why is that it's not just tension on the muscle that matters, it's tension in a stretch position kind of plays a disproportionate effect. So, if you put the same amount of effort into training full squats and half squats, generally your quads are going to grow more doing full squats because you are loading your quads through a somewhat stretched position. And so I think one way that you could kind of shoot yourself in the foot using accommodating resistance is if you used way too much of it. So, if you put so much band tension on the bar or so much chain weight on the bar that the lockout becomes a limiting factor, then essentially what you're doing at that point is limiting the load you can place on yourself when your muscles are in a stretch position. So, let's say a good training weight, if you're just doing free weight bench press, is 200 pounds. If you put, and let's say you can barely lock out 300 pounds if you were doing like a 4-board press. If you put like 300 pounds of chain weight on the bar or something ridiculous like that, then, you'd essentially not be able to put any straight weight on the bar. So you wouldn't be challenging yourself at the bottom end of the bench press, and it would be super hard at the top. And you essentially wouldn't be exposing your pecs, triceps, front delts to substantial loading in the stretch position. And yeah, I think that could probably do more harm than good when it comes to hypertrophy. That is obviously a somewhat ridiculous scenario. The people I see using accommodating resistance these days aren't that dumb about it, but and this could just be because I'm old and I've been lifting for a long time. I remember when I got into it during like the heyday of West Side, people heard Louis say, "Oh, lots of band tension is good." And they took that to, level 1,000,000 and would just put like hundreds and hundreds of pounds of band tension on the bar. And so they would effectively not be moving any weight at the bottom of a bench press or bottom of a squat, and then would be straining to lock out like the last 2 inches, which is dumb. I don't think many people do that anymore, but if that is something you do, I don't think that's that good for hypertrophy. So now let's address kind of a more normal use scenario. So let's say you are using appropriate accommodating resistance. The movement is similarly challenging throughout, or maybe still slightly more challenging at the bottom, but it's not just stupid easy at lockout. That's kind of what you're aiming for with accommodating resistance. I think at that point, one could make an argument if you think tension through a stretch position is kind of the more important thing, that it wouldn't really do anything good or bad for hypertrophy. It would be just as good as training with straight weight. And there is some reason to believe that would be the case. So there aren't that many studies comparing isotonic resistance training, which is the type most people do most of the time, squats, deadlifts, curls, etc., with isokinetic resistance training, which is essentially using machines to accomplish what you're trying to do with bands and chains. You can tell a machine, I want to extend my knee at 30 degrees per second. You kick out as hard as possible, and it gives you the amount of resistance required to not be able to exceed 30 degrees per second of knee extension torque. So, at the start, maybe it's not giving you quite as much resistance. As you're able to kick harder, it gives you more. You're a little bit weaker right at full knee extension, so it gives you a little bit less there. But it essentially perfectly matches resistance to torque output. And so that's kind of doing exactly what you want bands and chains to do. And there aren't that many studies comparing isotonic and isokinetic resistance training and their effects on hypertrophy. But the stuff that's out there kind of suggests that isokinetic resistance training doesn't improve hypertrophy results relative to isotonic training, which kind of makes me think that accommodating resistance probably won't positively affect hypertrophy either. probably not negatively affect it, but, kind of giving you the same overall results. One could make the case that it would be beneficial. So another potential mechanism, or at least like proxy measure associated with hypertrophy, is level of muscle deoxygenation. So there was a study that I wrote about in Mass a couple years ago. Lead author was Goto, and it was looking at like full range of motion versus constant tension, partial range of motion triceps extensions. And so one group was training from 0 degrees of elbow flexion to 120. So that's pretty full range of motion. The other group, I want to say, was keeping elbow flexion between 90 degrees and 30 degrees. So not going down quite all the way and also not locking out all the way. And they found that the partial range of motion group experienced more triceps hypertrophy. And also within both groups, and when pooling both of the groups as well, they found that the total amount of muscle deoxygenation experienced during the training session was positively associated with the amount of hypertrophy that took place. And so if that is a decent proxy for hypertrophy, or at least something contributing to hypertrophy, one could then potentially make the case that accommodating resistance would be possibly beneficial. Because essentially, like, you're never fully relaxing your prime movers when you're, benching, squatting, whatever. But near the top, you can kind of relax a little bit. You don't have to put that much effort into it. And so maybe that's, giving a chance for more oxygen to get into those muscles, clear some of the waste products out. And, maybe constant tension is like a super good thing for hypertrophy. And so with accommodating resistance, it would keep more tension on the muscles through a longer range of motion. I still think that if you're performing reps as a power lifter would, with like a clear distinction between the end of one concentric and the start of the next eccentric, where you're standing at the top of a squat for like 2 seconds to catch your breath before you do the next rep, I still kind of think that would negate any of the benefits of like constant tension type benefits that you may be able to get from accommodating resistance. But if you're doing like bodybuilder style reps, if one assumes bodybuilder style reps is kind of more of a constant tension approach, then I could see accommodating resistance possibly making that even a little bit more effective, because you're making the muscles work harder through a longer range of motion, which may lead to maybe more muscle deoxygenation and maybe more hypertrophy. Like I said, since the isotonic versus isokinetic research does kind of speak to that directly, I would prioritize that over my mechanistic speculation about muscle deoxygenation. So I kind of think that it wouldn't necessarily improve hypertrophy either, but also wouldn't hinder it. But I am open to the idea that it could be beneficial. So just to wrap this up, if you're stupid about accommodating resistance and put way too much band tension or way too many chains on the bar, I could see it being a negative. But if you apply it smartly, I think it's going to be neutral to positive. I kind of think neutral, but am certainly open to the idea of it being beneficial, especially if you're doing like constant tension style reps.